The Knights began as a hospital order, not a military order, in the Middle East, providing aid and comfort to crusaders and travelers alike. We'll talk a bit more about their founding when we meet Brother Bernard. The Middle East was, in very general terms, controlled by the Ottomans. The back and forth between the Ottomans, representing the Muslims, and the Europeans, representing Christians, went on for several centuries. The Knights had set up in Jerusalem in 1136. 60 years later, Jerusalem fell to the Ottomans, and the Knights moved to Acre. About 125 years after that, Acre fell to the Turks, and the Knights fled to Cyprus, where they stayed, constantly harassing Turkish shipping and generally making a pain in the neck out of themselves, as far as the Turks were concerned, for about 10 years, when they were forced out again and moved to Rhodes. They stayed there for another 10 years or so and were forced out yet again. The Knights wandered the Mediterranean for another 12 years, still harassing Turkish shipping, until they finally settled in Malta in 1530. They knew this was going to be their last stand. Many men were involved in the planning and execution of the Great Siege of Malta. On the left you see Jean Parisot de la Valette, who was the Grand Master of the Knights of St. John Hospitaller. On the right you see Suleiman the Magnificent, who commanded the forces of the Ottoman Empire. Each was powerful, persuasive, and stubborn. Each one wanted to win this fight. Valette was built on the spine of the Scriberus Peninsula, which you can see in this map. It sits between two large natural harbors and across the bay from the Knights' first settlements in and around Burgoo. Most of the Scriberus Peninsula was empty, although there was a fort at one end which the Knights had strongly fortified during the short time between when they arrived and the first great siege occurred. The Knights built their galleys and continued to harass Turkish shipping wherever they could find it. Eventually Suleiman had enough. It wasn't long before he planned to invade the island and destroy both the Knights and their fleet. In May 1565, the Ottoman Armada arrived outside of Fort St. Elmo and laid siege not just to the fort, but to the entire island. The battle lasted for 4 months and goes by the name of the Great Siege. The Knights were commanded by Jean Parisot de la Valette, an incredibly tough, strong-minded man. He had served with the Knights for a very long time. He had been captured by the Turks and been forced to work as a galley slave for a time and managed to survive it. He had absolutely no illusions about what would happen to him, his men, and the island should the Knights fail to hold the island against the Turks. De la Valette had a force of around, and estimates vary, perhaps 6,000 men in all, including 500 Knights. Against them, Suleiman sent a fleet of 35,000 to 40,000 soldiers, sailors, attendants, and slaves. The fleet stationed itself outside of Fort St. Elmo and began an attack against the fort, which they thought would take about a week. The Knights and other men-at-arms managed to hold out for 7 weeks. At the end of it, all of the Knights and the other defenders were either dead or were slaughtered when the Turks finally collapsed the walls. Came at a horrible cost, however. Estimates are that the Turks lost 6,000 men, about as many as de la Valette commanded in total, along with half of Suleiman's fiercest troops, the Janissaries. The Knights' tactic to delay, to fight, and to bleed the enemy continued for the rest of the battle. In what was probably the most famous siege of the age, the Knights managed to hold out for nearly 4 months. Their European supporters sent prayers, but were slow to send men and reinforcements. The Knights were at the end of their rope by the end of September and running out of everything: men, supplies, medicine, even water. But the Turks were in no better condition and were at the end of an enormous supply line. The end of the sailing season, in an age when galleys were powered by a combination of wind and human rowers, was upon them. There was a power struggle also between the commander of the fleet, who wanted to load up and set sail for safety and home while he still could, and the military commanders who felt sure that if they just had a few more weeks, they could win this thing. At this point, Suleiman's commanders made a huge error. They mistakenly believed that a very small reinforcement arriving late in the game was the tip of the spear of a much larger group of men soon to be upon them. Suleiman's navy loaded up the remains of the expeditionary force and set sail for home, at least for them. They meant to return the next year. After the Great Siege, the Knights were determined to turn all of Malta into a fortress that befitted the order, with a capital city worthy of their name. De la Valette, who we met earlier, laid the foundation stone for the city, which would bear his name, with a plan to move the headquarters of the order from the crowded area around Burgoo to a newer, bigger, more heavily fortified, and much grander capital. In moving the order from Burgoo to the newly created Valette, he needed a cathedral. The co-cathedral is that building. Come back next time and we'll begin our tour of Malta, and in particular Valette, here on the Armchair Traveler. If you think this content is interesting or useful, please like, share, and subscribe. This will help the channel grow. Travel content often involves a lot of history, and history can be really word heavy enough that the details often don't make it into a video blog. If you care to dig deeper, you can visit my regular blog on WordPress, where you'll find deep dives, travel tips, reviews, warnings, and the nuts and bolts on how to travel safely and conveniently. If you'd like to keep up with my posts, you can follow me on Twitter. The addresses are on your screen.